So those who are online already, I'd like to welcome you to this Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series talk with Dr. Einat Wilf. I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and this is the Leonard B. Torobin Memorial Lecture. Mr. Torobin was interested in Israeli affairs, and it's appropriate this year that Dr. Wilf can be giving the talk. If you have not read her book, The War of Return, it is, I would recommend this very strongly. It goes in detail into the events from the 1948 war basically up to the present, looking at issues that have been the obstacles, especially the right of return, as an obstacle to the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. So The War of Return, I would strongly recommend. Marcia Torobin has generously underwritten the program today, and Marcia will do the introduction.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Einat Wilf, this year's speaker for the Leonard B. Torobin Memorial Lecture. Dr. Wilf is a leading thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. She was a member of the Israeli Parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and was a member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces and was foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres. She has a BA from Harvard and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Wilf grew up as a member of the Israeli left, who believed that when the Palestinians would have their own sovereign state, Israel would finally live in peace. Her books, including her most recent, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace, which she co-authored, provide an informed and realistic perspective on Israel and the Middle East today. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Einat Wilf.
And thank you so much for having me and for generously hosting me. And I sincerely hope to travel to Santa Fe one point when things resume in person. So I want to share with you a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then of course go into some of the themes of the book. As mentioned, I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in a social and political environment that was very much associated with the political left, and especially with the Israeli Labor Party. As I grew of age in the 80s and the early 90s, my politics very much was the politics of the Labor Party. Meaning, at that point, the Labor Party began to move away from the focus on socialism into a focus on peace. And the idea was that Israel finally has a path to peace, which is dependent on a very simple formula. The formula was famously known as land for peace. This was simple and attractive. And the idea was that the peace that eluded Israel as soon as it was born is possible thanks to the lands that Israel acquired as a result of the 1967 war. The reasoning was this: after 1948, none of Israel's Arab neighbors were willing to make peace with it. The only things they were willing to sign were ceasefire agreements. And this is important because the message of all Arab nations whose armies invaded Israel in an effort to prevent the establishment of the State of Israel were basically saying, even though we were defeated in the 1948 round, it doesn't mean that we accept the outcome. And therefore, we're only signing a ceasefire, which means the fighting is over for now, but it will resume and with the same purpose, which indeed it did in a major way in 1967. And then there was, of course, a resounding defeat of the Arab effort to destroy Israel via military invasions. As a result of the war, of course, Israel triples in size, acquires the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Golan Heights in the north, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the center. With this territorial assets, the idea was that Israel could now trade those territorial assets in order to finally have peace with its Arab neighbors. Hopefully, those Arab neighbors understand that Israel is not to be vanquished militarily and will be willing to make peace with it based on territorial exchange. Of course, initially, 1968, the answer is no, no, and no. But over time, the idea of land for peace begins to dominate the process of negotiations with some success. Egypt basically signs a peace agreement with Israel on this formula. It gets the Sinai Peninsula in its entirety and signs a peace agreement with Israel. And we can discuss how deep that peace actually goes, but the idea was Israel gave land, it got peace. The 1990s were really dominated by the land for peace formula. Israel was negotiating with the Syrians over the Golan Heights. It signed another peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its territorial claims to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight of the 90s were the direct negotiations with the PLO over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. Now, these negotiations of land for peace really come to a head in the year 2000. Ehud Barak, the head of the Labor Party, the head of the Israeli peace camp, I voted for him, of course. He was voted on the agenda of going to make peace. This was his platform for the elections. And he goes to Camp David, which is symbolic. This is where peace with Egypt was negotiated. And he puts on the table a proposal that was meant to address all the obstacles and things that we are told that were necessary for making peace with the Palestinians. So first, the land for peace formula. The Palestinians were going to have a fully independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with direct borders with Egypt and Jordan. So if we're told that the occupation or land is the reason we don't have peace, that was going to end. There was going to be a fully independent Palestinian state, so an end to Israel's military presence in the West Bank and Gaza. The settlements, another aspect of land. If we're told that settlements are the reason we don't have peace, well, the new independent state of Palestine was going to have no settlements. They were going to be either dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. So if we're told that settlements are the reason we don't have peace, that was not going to be an issue. Jerusalem was going to be divided between Israel and Palestine, the Arab neighborhoods going to Palestine, and the Old City, including parts of the Old City, holy sites. The city was going to be divided and they were going to go to the Palestinians. So land, settlements, occupation, Jerusalem, all the things that we are told are an obstacle to peace were no longer going to be the case. The Palestinians would have had their own independent state with no occupation, with no settlements, in a capital in East Jerusalem. All the Palestinians had to do was say yes. What do? Walk away. Arafat walks away from this opportunity in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert in 2008. They walk away. There were some other instances, but those are the two prominent ones in our recent lifetime. They walk away. Now, you could say that's a negotiation tactic, nothing wrong with walking away. But they walk away to no criticism, which means that in doing so, they were doing something that the people wanted, or at least didn't oppose. There were no Palestinians op-eds or NGOs or movements that said, are you crazy? We were on the verge of having a Palestinian state. Go back into the negotiating table and get us that. No. When Arafat and later Abu Mazen walk away from opportunities to have a Palestinian state, they're doing something that their people want. And not only do they walk away to no criticism, what follows is this wave of violence, especially in 2001, 2, 3. It's a wave of murderous, bloody massacres, of buses being exploded, entire families in hotels and cafes blown to bits. And this was literally minutes, days after Palestinians could have had their state. So a lot of Israelis, like myself, like my co-author Adi Schwartz, people of the Israeli peace camp who genuinely believed in the land for peace formula, are asking a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? What do they want? They clearly don't want a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza because they could have had that. They clearly don't want an end to the occupation because they could have had that. They don't want an end to the settlements. They could have had that. Even Jerusalem is not what they want. Or you might say they want all of these things, but there's something that they want much, much more. There's something that is so much more important to them that they're willing to walk away from all these other things in order to preserve that. What is that thing? What is the most important thing for Palestinians? And what Adi and I realized is that the answer was staring us in the face. And we were looking and we didn't see it, or when we did see it, we just ignored it. What the Palestinians wanted is what they've always said they wanted: from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free of a Jewish state. The idea is that the top priority for the Palestinians has, and still is, unfortunately, to have one Arab state with no sovereign state for the Jewish people in any borders and on any territory whatsoever. Amazingly, the person who really saw it, and we're talking already in February of 1947, is Ernst Bevin. He's the British foreign minister. If you know anything about him, you know he was no friend to the Jewish people and certainly no fan of Zionism. He goes to the British Parliament in February 47 to explain why Britain is leaving and giving back the mandate to the United Nations. And he says this: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict is irreconcilable. He calls it irreconcilable. And he's on to explain. He says, in the land, there are Jews and Arabs. So again, there's no confusion about who the two groups are, who the two people are: Jews and Arabs. It's not religions, it's peoples, two collectives, two nations. Jews, Arabs. And he says each group has a top priority. He calls it the point of principle. That's the most important thing for each collective. He says for the Jews, the point of principle, the top priority, is to establish a state. So the Jews want a state. He says for the Arabs, the top priority is for the Jews not to establish a state in any part of the land. And he says it, in any part of the land. Now, it's a fascinating definition of the conflict, and it's still relevant today, and it has also been the best predictor of how both sides have behaved to the present. The Jews want a state, which is why they say yes to partition, because even though it's half of the land and it doesn't include Judea or Zion, it fulfills their top priority of a Jewish state. The Arabs say no and follow it by a very violent and brutal and murderous war. They say no to partition because for them, partition frustrates their top priority of no Jewish state in any borders. So this continues all the way, and in the book we discuss it. Now, for many decades, as long as the Soviet Union was in existence and was the main backer of the Palestinians, that was very obvious to everyone. The Palestinians wanted the Jews not to have a state. That's the essence of the conflict, which is why it's irreconcilable. When the Palestine Liberation Organization is established in 1964, that's before Israel controls the West Bank and Gaza, that's before there are any settlements. The Palestine they wish to liberate is the state of Israel. So that's what they've always wanted, and it was very clear. When does it become a little more muddled? When the Soviet Union collapses, Palestinians no longer have backing, they begin to turn to the West. As they turn to the West, they do not change their goals, but they do emphasize a language of justice and rights, which is incredibly appealing to the West. Except that if you look at what the Palestinians say and what they say they mean by justice or rights, it's very clear. When they say justice, so when there's a group on campus called Students for Justice in Palestine, Palestinians have only one form of justice that they consider. That justice is correcting the injustice, which is the very existence of the state of Israel. It's a very annihilationist form of justice, a vigilante almost form of justice. Basically says the injustice is the very existence of the state of Israel. Therefore, Students for Justice in Palestine is easily understood by Palestinians as students for no Jewish state in Palestine. That's how you achieve justice. The other thing they talk about is rights. And here, again, when Westerners hear of rights, they think, sure, individual rights, the rights to association and all that, free speech, freedom of religion. When Palestinians speak of rights, they speak of only one right. The rights that is actually not a right, but what they call the right of return. In the book, Adi and I show how this is neither a right, it's not legally sanctioned, and it's not a return, because the millions of people who claim it have never been in Israel, have never lived it, and even the few who were never its citizens. So they do not have in any treaty, in any UN decision, even the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 does not give it to them. They claim it's a right of return. It's not a right, it's not a return. But let's understand what they think it is, because that's the most important part. Palestinians believe that millions of them, the numbers range from 5.5 to 9 million, they believe that millions of Palestinians possess the right, they believe it's a right, they call it sacred, they call it holy. They believe they possess a sacred right to settle inside the state of Israel, so not in the West Bank and Gaza, in breach of Israel's sovereignty. And of course, the numbers are such that the exercise of this right would mean the transformation of Israel into an Arab state with a Jewish minority. So this is the vision of the Palestinians, has always been, and it is mostly manifested at this point in the idea of a right of return. The invading Arab armies are long gone. Terrorism, even though always existing, is pretty much at bay. So the way that you really can understand that this is still the Palestinian vision is by focusing on the right of return. And this is the case that Adi and I make in the book. All the issues of settlements and occupation in Jerusalem are basically marginal to the one primary issue of the right of return. And even the right of return itself is merely a symptom to the deep-seated Arab and Palestinian rejection of the right to a Jewish sovereign state in any borders whatsoever. Now, the book doesn't just speak about that, about the fact that this is what the Palestinians want and have always wanted, and they're very devoted and dedicated to that. It actually speaks about the fact that the West has indulged them in that worldview for decades, basically extending the conflict long beyond what it should have been. And in the book, we show how throughout the 20th century, as people basically moved from a political organization under empires into the political organization of nation states, this is pretty much the 20th century. We begin the 20th century when much of the earth is divided between empires, and we end the 20th century when much of the earth is divided between nation states. Israel and Zionism are actually a normal and non-distinctive part of that global transition from empire to nation state. In that process, and this was a bloody process that involved 2 world wars, numerous civil wars, decolonization, numerous border wars, this is a bloody process that creates tens of millions of refugees throughout the 20th centuries. Turks and Greeks and Bulgarians and Poles and Ukrainians and Germans and Hindus and Muslims, and none of them are refugees today. Because throughout the 20th century, the message to all refugees, except the Palestinians, was very non-indulgent. The message was, it's tragic, it's tough, and move on. The message for all refugees was that they move on, they build their lives in the places to which they fled, or to new places, but they don't look back. They don't go back. The Palestinians were the only ones who were indulged. Now, just imagine the situations. The Palestinians reject the political idea of partition. They don't want a state for themselves in any part of the land if another part of it will be Jewish. So their top priority is no Jewish state. They don't want a state for themselves. That's not that important. They wage a bloody war. In that war, people become refugees. Again, not special. There's nothing special about how Palestinians became refugees in the course of war as empires disappeared and new nation states emerged to replace them. Nothing special. What is special is the fact that they have been indulged for decades by the West in keeping the war going. Rather than being given the message that was given to all other refugees of tough, tragic, move on, they were told, you know what, you don't have to move on. You can keep yourselves in an eternal limbo where you believe you are refugees generation after generation, where the war is continuously alive because you refuse to say that the war is over, you refuse to accept its outcome, and you can maintain yourselves as a people in this endless limbo until the day when you will win this war and, from their perspective, take back the land that they believe is entirely and exclusively theirs. This is what they've been indulged by the West through an organization which after 70 years is still temporary, and that tells you a lot, called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is not a humanitarian organization. It's basically the organization that keeps alive for Palestinians the idea that the war of 1948 is still open and that they are still refugees from that war generation after generation. Now, just so you understand some of the absurdities and the extent of the indulgence by UNRWA and by the Western countries that fund it, such as, sadly, the United States and Europe and Australia. At the same time that UNRWA is established to settle the Arab refugees from the war, most of whom fled to the West Bank, Gaza, and Jordan, where Jordan naturalized them as citizens, both in the West Bank and Jordan. UNRWA is established at the same time. The K stands for Korea. Now, UNRWA settles 3 times the number of the Arab refugees, so 2 million Koreans. It does so in a few short years and for a quarter of the budget that was given to UNRWA at the time. And that's it. And you do not have tens of millions of Koreans sitting on the border with North Korea, seething with hate and a demand for revenge. Look at where South Korea is today. It could have been the Palestinians. But for a variety of reasons, which we discuss in the book, such as the Cold War and the Eisenhower Doctrine and oil, of course, Palestinians are indulged and allowed to keep the war against Israel open and to not have to move on with their lives. As a result, UNRWA, after 70 years, is still a temporary organization. It recently celebrated 70 years, and I thought that's about the last thing you need to celebrate. You were supposed to be a temporary organization that closes after a few years when you achieve what you were intended to achieve, which was to settle the Arab refugees to begin a new life. So they're a temporary organization celebrating 70 years, during which it has become the organization that provides the ongoing non-emergency, non-humanitarian schooling services and healthcare services for the Palestinians as they maintain themselves to win the war against Israel, to exercise return. And this had tremendous impact. In the book, we show how in the UNRWA schools, a Palestinian nationalism is born, and there's nothing wrong with a new national identity being born. A lot of new nations have recent identities, but the national identity of the Palestinians, which is born in the UNRWA schools, is one that is singularly focused on revenge and return, which is why we tell the stories of those who committed the Munich massacre of the Israeli athletes. They were children of the refugee camps, graduates of UNRWA schools, who believe that they can do anything, and anything is justified, including slaughtering athletes at an Olympics, in order to return, in order to take back what they believe is exclusively theirs. So this is what UNRWA has done: extended the conflict by generations, prevented the process of moving on. And of course, at the end of the day, the people who pay the price for it are us, who could have lived in peace, state next to another state, but actually need to continue this conflict because the other side is somehow indulged in the view that the war is not over. And just to get a sense also of the complete absurdity of how UNRWA maintains this political fiction, is the refugee issue in the minds of Palestinians looms incredibly large. In many ways, I would say this is the only issue. To be a Palestinian is to be a refugee and to believe in return. That is the essence of the Palestinian identity. So it looms large in terms of who they are. But as a practical matter, it's actually very small. UNRWA registers 5.6 million so-called refugees in its areas of operations: Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But in effect, at best, 5% of them merit any notion that they are refugees. About 40% of them, 2.2, live in the West Bank and Gaza. So they are settled. They've been born there, they live there, they've lived there their entire lives. Whatever your political opinions, from their perspective, they live in Palestine. They live in the West Bank and Gaza. They've been born in Palestine. They haven't experienced war. They haven't been displaced by war. They don't need to be resettled. Where they are is where they need to build their future. They're not refugees. Another 40%, another 2.2 million, are citizens of Jordan. Jordan naturalized the refugees because it was the only country willing to consider making peace with Israel, which is, of course, why a Palestinian extremist murdered and assassinated King Abdullah, precisely because he naturalized them and was willing to send the message of tough, tragic, move on. But they're citizens. Nowhere in the world are people who are citizens somehow still considered refugees from another country. But they maintain that they're still refugees. Many of them, by the way, are middle class, some of them wealthy business people, but they maintain that label. Another million live in Syria and Lebanon, where they indeed did not get citizenship, but most of them have left. We know from recent data, they left, they have other citizenships. My favorite example is the multi-millionaire playboy American citizen father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. He's not a refugee, and yet he's registered on UNRWA's books in Syria as a refugee because they never take anyone off the books. So we are left with about 200, 300,000 Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon who are indeed stateless and need to be resettled. Those are the kinds of numbers that the real UN agency for refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, knows to settle in a period of 5, at most 10 years. So the practical issue of the refugees is very small. But the idea of it, because it reflects the continued Palestinian rejection of the idea of a Jewish state in any borders, that's the thing that needs to be addressed. And I'll just end by saying that I start the book by telling how I was part of the peace camp and I worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, and with Shimon Peres, but I still very much consider myself of the Israeli peace camp. I just would say perhaps I'm more of a long-term optimist, in the sense that I think that at the end of the day, in the land, there are Jews and Arabs. Whatever one side thinks about the other, we are two distinct peoples. And I think we would benefit from governing ourselves in two separate national state entities. But we cannot get to that point until the war is over. And in the book, we have a very simple phrase: for there to be peace, war must end. Very basic, but this is the idea that eluded a lot of people, that from the Palestinian perspective, the war of 1948 is still very much an open case. What needs to happen is, like all other refugees in the world, the indulgence must stop. They need to appreciate that the war is over, that they can live next to a Jewish state of Israel, but not instead of that state. The day that they accept that is the day we have peace.
Thank you for your comments. And I would like to ask a question. It seems a contradiction in a way, the idea of the right of return to Israel, which would make Israel a predominantly Palestinian state then, and also the idea of from the river to the sea, which suggests a Palestinian state that's not Israel, not primarily Palestinian. Could you speak to that? How do those two ideas fit together?
Certainly. The vision is from the river to the sea. The vision is no Jewish state whatsoever in any of the territory. The idea of return is the mechanism by which this is supposed to happen. So if you exercise this so-called but non-existent right of return, Israel, through this process, becomes an Arab majority state with a Jewish minority. So when Palestinians say, we support a two-state, let's say during the 90s and some even recently, but when you ask them, and very few people ask them, you ask them about the right of return, they'll be like, okay, that's sacred, that's holy. So when you put 2 and 2 together, then the only two states they imagine are a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Palestinian state that overturns Israel. And then they can come together to be one Palestinian state from the river to the sea. It's all different ways of basically saying nowhere, in no territory and in no borders will a Jewish state be acceptable to us.
There's a question in the Q&A function, and it's asking, how many UNRWA officials did you speak with in the process of doing the research for the book?
So a bit about UNRWA and officials and the structure. UNRWA, a bit going back, was going to be called REWA, R-E-W-A, relief something. But the Arabs insisted that it be called UNRWA, even though it's not really a UN agency, it's not part of the UN structure, it's a temporary organization, it doesn't get a regular UN budget, but they wanted it to be called UNRWA because they knew, or they already sensed, that there would be power in those two letters, UN, the power of legitimacy. And they wanted that legitimacy because from the Arab perspective, Israel is a foreign implant created by colonialist powers, and having UNRWA in the name was a way of saying, you're responsible. You, the world, the West, you are responsible. This has nothing to do with us. And that was a very powerful message still in the Arab world, that they bear zero responsibility for anything that happened. It's all on the West or on the UN. So they wanted it to be called UNRWA for that element of legitimacy. Now, as I said, within a few short years, it became clear that the Arab refugees themselves, not their leaders, the Arab refugees themselves refused any form of settlements because they refused to accept that the war is over, and UNRWA could not achieve its goals. So at the time, the countries that were funding it, the US and the UK, wanted to close UNRWA. They were like, okay, Ankara and the Korea did great. UNRWA in the Middle East is useless. Let's close it down. I mean, we're not achieving anything. No one is being resettled. And in a scene we show in the book, almost taken out of Godfather, the US has basically threatened to keep UNRWA open, basically telling them, you made the mistake of supporting partition, don't make that mistake again. You know, we're going to use UNRWA to overturn partition, don't close UNRWA. So from that moment on, UNRWA remains as a temporary organization that can no longer settle anyone. What is it going to do? So it starts providing vocational services, and over time it becomes schooling and healthcare, and it becomes basically the non-emergency social services structure of the Palestinians. Now, this means that the staff of UNRWA is Palestinian. When you look at the structure, the people of UNRWA are almost all Palestinians. This is something you do not have in a refugee agency. Like the UNHCR is made by UN professionals who deal with how to resettle refugees. But because UNRWA is not really a refugee agency, it's the social services office of the Palestinians, it's all Palestinians. Palestinian teachers and staff people. So it's a Palestinian organization with a very, very thin veneer of Westerners, because those are the people that need to get the money. UNRWA is an organization that needs to raise money every year because it's temporary and it's not part of the UN structure. So in order to go to European and American capitals, much better to send a Swiss person who feels guilty for some reason than to send a Palestinian who says from the river to the sea, even though that's most of what UNRWA staff is. Those Westerners are very, very small, thin facade for the organization. Almost all of them have gone native in the sense that they promote the UNRWA narrative of right of return and perpetual refugeehood. There were one or two who did not go native, and obviously I spoke to them. I also spoke with the others, but as I said, they're not people who will even acknowledge that UNRWA is anything but just something that does good. What I did speak to a lot are the funders of UNRWA. So those are the Western diplomats who are funding UNRWA on a regular basis, whose countries fund UNRWA on a regular basis. And as a result, I ended up inventing a word called Westplaining. And Westplaining, much like mansplaining, has the same attitude of telling other people what they think, even though they are perfectly capable of saying it themselves. So Palestinians are saying things very clearly, what they want. But then when you speak to Westerners about this, and we brought to them all the research, and I think if you read the book, it's very intense on research. We bring all the research, we show that what the Palestinians themselves are saying. And what do you hear from Westerners? They will say things like, they don't mean it. They're angry. They know that it's not going to happen. It's a delusion. It's a bargaining chip. Now, in the 90s, you could legitimately believe that this was a bargaining chip, that the Palestinians would forgo this idea of right of return and perpetual refugeehood once they had a state. This is not a legitimate position now, when empirically Palestinians have chosen to negotiate away a state when they could, in order to keep fighting for return. So you cannot seriously still argue that this is a bargaining chip. And when some Westerners tell me that Palestinians are merely, they know it's not going to happen, I'm like, they don't know that. Talk to them. And one of the things that I'm very proud of in the book is that we actually let Palestinians speak for themselves rather than explaining away what they say. Talk to Palestinians. They look at the map, they see 7 million Jews struggling to maintain a sovereign state in the midst of 500 million Arabs, 1.5 billion Muslims. Palestinians rationally conclude that the Zionist experiment is temporary, will not last, and all they have to do is wait us out. They're not delusional. It's not irrational. So one needs to understand why they are willing to devote themselves generation after generation to this idea that Israel is temporary and will one day disappear. They genuinely believe that Israel's very existence on a land that in their mind is exclusively theirs is something shameful that needs to be gotten rid of, that they're the vanguard of this battle against the invading foreigners and the crusaders, and they genuinely believe that one day they will win, that if we look into the future a century from now, there will be a single Arab state, Zionism will have been a long forgotten chapter like that of the Crusaders, and Palestine will be from the river to the sea. So Palestinians are very serious about their vision, and the only way they can be disabused of that is if the West, and increasingly and even more important, the Arab world, basically tell them enough is enough.
There is a question that says your narrative on refugees resembles that of Bill Clinton and Dennis Ross and others, and their discussions of the Camp David process. And it also mentions the Tabia conference at the end of January in 2001, and ask if you can comment on that.
So I think one of the things that when you look over times of the history is there tends to be a lot of focus on individuals and specific events and who said what, and let's have a courageous leader, and did Arafat, was Ehud Barak nice to Arafat or not? But I don't believe in these things. I think that ultimately you need to look fundamentally at what the people want and what the people are willing to accept. And right now, the Palestinian identity is wrapped up in the notion of no Jewish state. This is inherent to who they are. In that, by the way, they're a little bit different from the rest of the Arab world. We're looking at some of the changes that are taking place, such as the Abraham Accords. The Arab world can imagine an Arab identity that is not necessarily anti-Zionist, or let's put it this way, that anti-Zionism is not at the core of its identity. The Palestinians, anti-Zionism is much more at the core of their identity because their identity has been shaped around that struggle. So for us to get to peace, that has to change. If we use Bevan's quote in a different way, I can basically say that the conflict is actually quite simple. You don't need many documentaries and people talking about this or that conference. All you need to say is basically this is a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. That's it. This is the conflict. So if this is the conflict, it ends in only one of two ways. Either Jewish Zionism disappears, which means that Arab anti-Zionism triumphs by violent means, by convincing Jews that they don't need a state and getting the Jews to leave. I don't know. But one way that the conflict ends is that Arab anti-Zionism triumphs, and that's it. Jews no longer have a state, however that happens. Another way by which the conflict ends, which obviously is my preference, is that Arab anti-Zionism goes away. So there very much still is an Arab identity, but it's no longer wrapped up in the idea of anti-Zionism. And this is a bit of what we're beginning to see with the Abraham Accords. So what is required to get to peace is no longer, we don't have a shortcut. It's no longer land for peace or settlements or all of that. Again, things that we can do about, but they don't give us a shortcut. The road to peace is a long road which requires the very transformation of the Palestinian identity. It requires Palestinians to reconceive themselves of a people with a constructive goal rather than a destructive one, of a people who seek to have a state next to Israel rather than instead of it. I believe, actually taking from Zionism, is that if you have a focused constructive goal, you're much more likely to achieve it. So that's the transformation that they need to go through. And they're not going to go through this transformation as long as they are indulged in the worldview that Israel is temporary and that they can undo Israel if they only wait us out.
In relation to your last comment, in page 213 in the book, you mentioned, unless resources are dedicated to dismantling the barrier of Palestine return, there will be no peace between Israel and the Palestinians. As long as the Palestinians feel that they are supported in their vision of an Arab Palestine from the river to the sea, they will continue the struggle armed and otherwise against Israel. Now, you mentioned unless resources are dedicated to dismantling the barrier of Palestinian return. What does that mean?
Okay. So the policies we recommend in the book are both policies of message and just policies of action. The policies of message are some of the ones that I talked about, and I will preface by saying that none of them are pleasant. So one of the problems is that a lot of the people, there's this concept in foreign policy, do you want to do good or do you want to feel good? Because often doing good means that you need to let go of feeling good. This is certainly a process that I had to go through. I'm from the Israeli left. I think generally people who are on the political left like to believe that they're good people. They're on the side of good. They want things like compromise and equality and justice. So I'm the person who favors a two-state solution, Palestinian state, no occupation, no settlements, divide Jerusalem. I'm in favor of all of these things. And then I meet Palestinians and I realize that from their perspective, given that I'm still a Zionist, given that I still want a sovereign state for the Jewish people in the other part of the land, as far as they're concerned, I'm just as evil as a right-wing settler, let's say. That's it, because from their perspective, any Jewish state in any borders is illegitimate. And if I support that, the fact that I support a smaller Jewish state doesn't make me nice in their eyes. So I had to let go of the understanding that to them, I'm a good person. And I think that in many ways has freed me to understand that to do good, I have to let go of feeling good. And that means saying some very harsh messages. What are those harsh messages? The war of 1948 is over. You Palestinians are not refugees by any international standards. You are just not refugees. There is no right of return. There isn't. There is just no such thing for a people to possess a collective right to settle in another country in breach of its sovereignty. It just doesn't exist. So you don't have a right of return, which means that we're not even asking you to give it up. You don't have it, so you don't have anything to give up. You're willing to make that demand all day long. It's not a right. And the harshest of messages, if this was not harsh enough, is the war of 1948 is over. And given that your purpose in that war was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in any borders, in that sense, you were defeated. And you have to accept it and move on. Now, I assure you, nobody likes to say these things. Everyone just likes to feel good. But that's what's needed. What's needed are, first and foremost, those harsh messages. Then they need to be backed up by policies, such as, first of all, dismantle UNRWA. There is nothing good that UNRWA can do. In the book, we have very specific proposals on how to the extent that countries want to fund the non-emergency ongoing education system of the Palestinians, they're welcome to do so, just not through the notion that Palestinians are refugees. And we show how to do that, give the money to Jordan, to the Palestinian Authority, to the UNHCR, to other agencies. Make clear that you're not willing to sustain the fiction that they are still refugees. And by the way, when President Trump defunded UNRWA, correctly realizing that the conditions that existed in the 50s that forced America to keep basically bribing the Arab world by paying up for UNRWA no longer exist, the response of the Palestinians to the American defunding of UNRWA, and America is the #1 funder of UNRWA, was not, how are we going to pay our teachers tomorrow? Their response was, the American president is trying to take away our right of return. They perceive the financial support for UNRWA as the equivalent of political legitimacy to their idea of a right of return, which is why the West has to stop funding UNRWA, dismantle it. This is a way of making it clear to Palestinians that they're not refugees. Issue legal opinions that make it clear that Palestinians don't have a right of return. Those are the things that need to happen. I do have to share with you that these days, I'm more optimistic about the Arab world doing that than the Western world doing that. Because to the credit of the Arab world, they always knew what the conflict was about. They were never confused to think that it had to do with settlement building or the occupation or anything like that. They always knew that this was a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism, that it was always about the idea that a Jewish state in any borders should not exist in any part of the territory. They knew that this was what the conflict is about. As a result, as some of them are moving away from a desire to continue the conflict, they're in the best position to tell Palestinians enough is enough. We are no longer eager to try to eradicate Israel. If anything, we actually recognize the Jews in Israel as Abraham, right? Abraham's descendants, the Abraham Accords. We recognize them no longer as foreigners, but as people that belong here, which is why we're no longer going to continue underwriting a blank check for Palestinian rejectionism. But those are the things that need to happen.
Marcia Torobin asks, will the Abrahamic, following up on your comment now, will the Abraham Accords have any impact on the Israeli-Palestinian relations? And if I could, I'd like to add an addendum to that, that the Abrahamic Accords are primarily with Sunni nations And the continuing support for the opposition to Israel tends to come from the Shiite nations. Could you comment about those issues and that divide in the Muslim world between Sunnis and Shiites in relation to the position on Israel?
Certainly. So if you want to look later, there's a YouTube video of a recent lecture I gave at Georgetown, where I'm a visiting professor now, called Arab Zionism and the Path to Peace. And I know that Arab Zionism suddenly sounds a little jarring, but I genuinely believe that we're beginning to see this transformation, and the Abraham Accords point to that. We're beginning to see Arab countries that even though they're small, such as the UAE, punch way above their weight. They project an image of success to the Arab world, who are basically saying they're flipping the narrative. They're not just, I mean, I know it's Iran matters and the F-35 matters, but these accords have transformational potential. I know here in the US, there seemed as if there was a tendency to minimize how important they were. But if you're in Israel, you realize how transformational they are. I don't know if you know the Emirates, the Dubai-Tel Aviv line is now the #1 line of the Emirates. Within a year and a half, these accords have been filled with agreements and friendships and tourism and cultural exchanges that are truly warm and point to a different vision of a Middle East in which Israel is embraced. And in fact, there's no better way to flip the narrative than to call these accords the Abraham Accords. The dominant narrative still in the Arab world is that Israel is a foreign implant, which means that given that it's a foreign implant, the proper policy is violence and resistance to push it out. This is still the dominant narrative in the Arab world, but it's beginning to change. And for the first time, you have an alternative worldview that says, no, the Jews in Israel are the Abrahamic Jews. They're our cousins. We share our history. We, the Muslims, we, the Arabs, recognize them as our kin, as people who belong here rather than as a foreign implant. And this has transformational potential. But the Palestinians are going to be the last to go through this transformation. Right now, their response is that the Abraham Accords are a betrayal, which from their perspective it is. They would get a blank check forever from the Arab world to keep fighting. And now that blank check is beginning to disappear. So they experience it as a betrayal. And you're right that some parts of it, not yet Abbas, but Hamas, of course, turned to Iran to get support. You know, if the Arab world support is beginning to disappear, if the Arab League could no longer be trusted to give a blank check to Palestinians, perhaps Iran. But this already shows you that it's no longer becoming the cause of the Arab world. If anything, it's beginning to be something that even divides the Arab world. Recently, there was an Iraqi overture by 300 Iraqi notables, Sunni and Shiite, who said that they want normalization with Israel. And they said something very interesting. They prefaced it by saying, we look at the Arab world and it's divided between a world of war and a world of peace, which plays on the cultural code of Islam being divided between the world of war and the world of peace. They said, we look at the Arab countries of war, Yemen and Libya and Syria and Lebanon, and we don't want to be like them. And we look at successful countries in peace like UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, and they're normalizing relations with Israel, and we want to be like them. So I've come to appreciate in discussing this with Emirati colleagues and friends and Bahrainis, is that the normalization with Israel is part of a bigger battle for an Arab identity and for a Muslim identity. In many ways, normalizations with Israel, I call it collateral benefit, in the sense that there's a bigger battle taking place where countries like the UAE seek to project an image of Arab success. Remember, after 9/11, everyone just talked about Arab failure, right? The failed Arab world, the deficit in the Arab world. And now you have this vibrant, small, but Arab country with gleaming skyscrapers and international university branches and museums and a space program. And it just announced yesterday that it's going to be the first paperless country in the world, paperless government. It is projecting an image of success. It's the #1 country 10 years running where young Arab people want to go work. So basically, normalization with Israel is now part of a package of what it means to have Arab success. And increasingly, the Palestinians are pushed into this notion of the past. Arab anti-Zionism belongs to the past. Now, they're still fighting a rearguard battle to try to replace that support. And what worries me, much more than the Iranian support, let's say, for Hamas, which is worrying, is the Western anti-Zionist support for the Palestinian cause. This, for me, is a tragedy, that at the exact moment when some countries in the Arab world are beginning to move away from their blanket support for Palestinians and for Palestinian rejectionism, you have Western anti-Zionists rushing to fill the void and to tell Palestinians, no, keep fighting for justice. And we talked about what justice is. Keep fighting for rights, the right of return. And at the end of the day, this fuels the conflict for more generations to come.
Following up on that question, the issue of Zionophobia, which you're hinting at, that is becoming such an issue in the United States. You've been in Georgetown this semester. What is your experience with this? What have you seen?
So one of the courses I taught here was called Zionism and Anti-Zionism. And I do hope at one point to be able to scale up the course, maybe offer it digitally, because I think my experience here has been that it had quite a bit of impact. And the reason is that this is a course that looks mostly at the last 150 years, but some before, of Zionist and anti-Zionist thought. And once you read, and it's a primary materials-based course, so you read the things directly. When you read about Zionism, not through the distorted lens that you have today, you actually let the Zionists speak for themselves. You understand what it is. When you read anti-Zionism and its various sources, and you look at Soviet anti-Zionism, for example, and you understand how literally the same nation that wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion after World War II gave it a secular version in the form of Soviet anti-Zionism, generating all the notions that Israel is about apartheid and racism and imperialism. And that's before 1967 and before settlements. So all these accusations predate anything that Israel did. So when you realize that the same nation that wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion literally is the nation that wrote the book of modern secular left-wing anti-Zionism, I think it's a pretty educational and eye-opening experience. I had a student that at the end of the course told me that this was worth to her more than tens of hours of therapy. And I think it was a very revealing comment. She said, I really needed that class, because what I realized in my discussions with some of the students is that anti-Zionism has the dynamic of bullying. And generally bullying preys on shame. If you're ashamed about your background or your class or how you look, it's easier to bully you. So a lot of the bullying of anti-Zionism is intended to shame Jews into any association with Israel and Zionism. And when you're ashamed, it's easier to bully you. which is why I realized, and sometimes but not jokingly, I say that the only effective response to anti-Zionism is Zionism. Basically, by standing up and saying, I am not ashamed that we, the Jewish people, pursued our right to self-determination, just like the Slovaks and the Czechs and the Hindus and Muslims. We're not ashamed of that, and therefore you cannot bully me. I found that it is the most effective response and the one that seems to contribute most to the mental health of the students.
You know, we have so many questions and a number that are really critical. And I know that we're at our time now. If you have time to answer a few more questions.
If people want to, yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. One of the questions that comes up is, you've commented on the issues that have come up from the Palestinian side. And the question is, do you believe that Israel has made any negative contribution to the peace process?
Okay, so I separate. In terms of negative contributions to the peace process, my answer is no. There is, or let me put it this way, as long as Israel insists on being the sovereign state of the Jewish people, that's our negative contribution to the peace process, because this is the essence of the conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. So within Israel, I speak against the settlements. And I've written a series of articles about how we need to separate the necessity of military presence in the West Bank from the absolute non-necessity of the civilian presence. But I'm also very clear that even if we remove all the settlements tomorrow, and Israeli soldiers would be nowhere to be seen, I don't know, it would all just be surveillance or something, that would still not bring peace. It would not even bring us 1 inch closer to peace, because that's not the problem. So my view is, again, within Israel, I think there are things that we need to do to preserve our ability to govern ourselves in a Jewish state, which, given the numbers, means it has to be a smaller state. But I think that's important for Israel, and that's important for the Jewish people. It's important for our ability to maintain a state where the Jewish people govern themselves and are not at the mercy of anyone else. But in terms of contributing to peace, the only problem we ever had was who we were. I recently wrote that at the end of the day, the only real problem with Zionism is anti-Zionism. The idea that a Jewish people have the right to self-determination in part of the lands of the Imperial Ottoman Empire is really no big deal. It's not, in the context of the 20th century, of the disappearance of empires, of the reclaiming of countries by nation states, there's nothing especially wrong with Zionism. It's just the deranged and persistent and prolonged opposition to this idea that leads us to still having to discuss it more than a century and a half after this idea was born. So the problem is the opposition to who we are, not the opposition to what we do. So we can have discussions about what Israel can do better in the sense for Israel or for the Jewish people, or I don't know for what, but for peace, it would not have made an iota of difference, because the only thing that will bring peace is when the Arab world, and especially the Palestinians, finally forgo their anti-Zionism. And you will find that the land can be divided, and settlements can be removed, and Jerusalem can be divided. All of these things can be done. The only thing that cannot be done is to split the difference between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. There's no compromise there, and precisely because there's no compromise there, we're still in conflict. The only way the conflict ends is either Jewish Zionism is defeated or Arab anti-Zionism is defeated. Either way, anything in the middle means continued conflict. So as long as Israel wants to be the home sovereign state of the Jewish people, That's the problem.
There are 2 or 3 comments, questions that address the issue of the right of the return. And among that, there is one with a website that I can't get all the information on, that says that there have been cases of the right of return for refugees in other contexts. The question, the comments in the question go on to say, will challenge the idea of the right of return is not internationally acceptable. And they also bring up the question of if Jews have the right of return to the homeland, then how is that parallel with the Palestinian claim? And what I would like to, again, I'd like to add into that is the Jews who were pushed out of Arab lands at the time after following 1948. There is also that question. There were perhaps as many as a million Jews pushed out of the various Arab countries. So I don't know if you can address that package.
Yeah, it's actually a good package to address together. So I was very precise in how I spoke. There is no right for a people to settle in another country in breach of that country's sovereignty. There are countries that wanted people. Typically, and we discuss it at length in the book, they wanted generally people who belonged to the ethnic majority. So if Poland wanted Polish refugees, it opened the gates to them. And that is very common, but it's not a right of return. What the Palestinians want is something that is against Israeli sovereignty. That is not a right that exists in international law. There are many cases where after wars, countries who wanted a certain group of people, typically the one that belonged to the ethnic majority, opened their gates to those people, never to the ones from the ethnic minority. That's not a right of return in the sense that it is against the sovereign will of the state. It's just that the sovereign state decided that those are people that it wants. And that's the important thing here. So for example, the state of, this is about sovereignty and immigration laws. The entire international system, by and large, is based on the idea of the sanctity of the sovereign state. Every state, one of the most basic elements of sovereignty is that it has the right to determine who gets in. Every state privileges certain groups. It could be an ethnic group, it could be a national group, it could be a linguistic group, it could be educational group, but every state gives certain privileges to certain people to enter and to become its citizens. Israel's immigration law that does so for Jews, again, is not special. The Palestinians were offered the same thing. The Palestinians in the various negotiations were offered, you will have your state, and when you have your state, open your borders to whoever you want. You want to privilege people of Palestinian descent, go ahead. But Palestinians rejected that because they didn't want, like the Jews, a state where they can open their borders to Palestinians. They wanted Israel to be settled by Palestinians. The reason, again, that it's never about the issue itself. It's not about the specific idea of return. It's about the notion that this is a mechanism by which you undo Israel. I can assure you, and we also show it in the book, when there was a moment when they didn't think return would undo Israel, they didn't want return. It's only the priority of undoing Israel to which this idea was developed. Now, the Jewish refugees from Arab lands, which, again, they were actually expelled, pushed out from the Arab world, partly because of decolonization, partly because in revenge for the establishment of the state of Israel. By the way, the biggest own goal of the Arab world, if there ever was one, It completely undermines their claim that Judaism is not a people, only a religion. Because if it's only a religion, why take revenge on Jews in your own country on something happening somewhere else? They threw out people who were great, productive, loyal members of the communities. And of course, they strengthened Israel at the moment that Israel really needed it. But again, those Jews, they're not refugees anymore. All of them have been settled largely by Israel and by France and other countries. And they do not possess a right of return. If Iraq tomorrow decides that it wants to give Iraqi Jews citizenship, very well, it's welcome to do so. But it's not a right that is enshrined in a way that overturns the sovereignty of a nation to decide whom it lets in, which now goes back to the Jewish story. So again, there's no legal right for anyone. If the sovereign state wants it, fine, but it's not enshrined as something that can breach that. And yes, a lot of refugees did go to countries that wanted them, but not to countries that didn't want them. And again, there was nothing wrong about not wanting them. This was the message to all refugees. Now, in terms of how Israel was established, it's important to say the right that was recognized for the Jewish people was the right to self-determination, not the right of return, which doesn't exist. The right to self-determination is the foundational principle of the political organization of our globe today. This is the process by which we moved from empires to nation state. This was the right that was equally recognized for the Palestinian Arabs in partition. Partition was about giving equal recognition to Jews and Arabs as possessing the right to self-determination, recognizing that both peoples have a connection and that they have the right. Now, Jews accepted it even though the partition was without Zion, without Jerusalem, without Judea. So Jews didn't go and saying, we have a right to every place that was ever mentioned in the Bible. What they asked was the right of the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Armenians, which was taken from them by the Turks, to self-determination. This was the right that was equally guaranteed for the Palestinians. Had the Palestinians or the Arabs at the time said yes to partition, there would have been no refugees, because the refugees were only in the process of war. Unlike the Jews from Arab countries who were expelled, did nothing, the Arabs in the land fled in the course of war. And there were some expulsions at the end in military operations as part, but it was in the course of war. That's completely normal. That's what happened throughout the 20th century across the world. So in the course of war, but the war was not necessary. All they had to do was say yes. They would have had their own state, no dispossession, no refugees, celebrating 73 years of independence next to a Jewish state. The tragedy, the derangement is that they have preferred to focus their entire people and resources on ensuring that there is no Jewish state in any borders, rather than on building their state in some of the land. So a lot of people make those mix-ups, but again, there's no right of refugees to settle in a country in breach of its sovereignty, especially when they were never its citizens. That right does not exist. Many countries let refugees in. Israel let a lot of Jewish refugees in. Once they've been settled, they're no longer refugees, but it is not a right that exists outside of that sovereign state. It is the right of the sovereign state to decide who enters. The Palestinians were repeatedly given the right to a sovereign state that would open its borders, and they have repeatedly rejected it because it didn't fulfill their top priority of no Jewish state in any borders.
David Israelovich has a question. which says, with the new Israeli government, is there an opportunity for novel Israeli policies on the Israeli-Palestinian relationships? And if so, what might those be?
It's actually quite the opposite. The new Israeli government has been made possible precisely because there are no big differences of policy on this issue anymore between most Israelis. As a result of the repeated Palestinian rejections, despite several Israeli efforts, as a result of the waves of murder and massacres, as a result also of the disengagement from Gaza and its aftermath, most Israelis occupy now a large central political area, which basically says, as long as the Palestinian vision is from the river to the sea, that's not really anything we can negotiate, so we're not going to even bother. The number of Israelis, certainly in parliament, Israeli Jews, who believe that the reason we don't have peace is because Israel didn't try hard enough, barely 3. So that's not really a worldview that has representation anymore. And also on the right side, the number of people who really care much about the settlements and expansion and annexation is also minimal. What you have is a large Israeli center that has made this government possible, that basically says, as long as this is the Palestinian worldview, there's nothing to negotiate. This is why ideas like Mika Goodman's shrinking the conflict has become very popular. So people are trying to look at how can we make lives better, how can we decrease the friction, but there's an understanding that, again, as long as this is an irreconcilable conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism, and as long as we still insist on being Zionist Jews and having our own state, then there's not much that can be done. And as a result, this government can focus on education and welfare and infrastructure, and that's what it's doing.
Let's take one last question, and actually it relates to a comment you just made. John Siskin says, does a strategy of shrinking the conflict offer a more constructive approach to what might be developed in the future and moving away from the anti-Zionism that exists now?
So I view them as 2 distinct processes. Reducing the amount of friction with the day-to-day lives of Palestinians. This is, by the way, something that has been going on for quite some time now. And, generally, I'm very supportive of that. I think that would be good for everyone. I even, in my series of essays in Haaretz, I even went further. I basically said we should just end the entire settlement project, annex the 2 to 4% of the territory adjacent to the ceasefire line, and basically declare that this is the end of any territorial claims we have, and leave the military in the West Bank, but not the settlements. I call this vision yes to the occupation, no to settlements. But it's another version of shrinking the conflict or reducing friction. That is not something that gets us any closer to ending the conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. It's just a way of making people's lives perhaps a little better, and that's always good. But it doesn't change anything in the dynamic of how we get to the end of conflict. That dynamic really depends much more on the harsh messages that I pointed to earlier. And in the book, we bring an example, maybe we can end with that. After World War II, Germany surrenders, right, unconditionally. It's occupied by the Allies and the war is over. And even though Germany already surrendered, 14 million ethnic Germans are pushed into carts out of what becomes Western Poland, the Sudetenland, and thrown into Germany. And in the book, we include some pretty brutal images of what it looked like. And this is after the war. This is not Palestinian refugees who are in the course of war that they're waging to prevent a Jewish state from being established. This is after the war. Germany has signed an unconditional surrender. 14 million ethnic Germans are made into refugees, sent into Germany. Do they want to return? Of course. They want their land back. They even have a name, Heimkehr, a so-called right of return. They want it back. Does anyone indulge them in that? Does anyone tell them you have a right of return? Absolutely not. It is universally understood that indulging this German idea that they can take back those lands will be recipe for more war. And this was the general understanding. When you indulge the idea of refugees going back, you are in breach of countries' sovereignties. You are opening the place for perpetual war, as has been the case with Israelis and Palestinians. So Germans are made into refugees. They're in Germany. They want return. No one indulges them. But even from that moment of defeat, surrender, and no one indulging them, it takes a full generation, 24 years, until Willy Brandt, becoming Chancellor of Germany, who, by the way, as opposition leader, was sympathetic to the cause of German return, basically signs an agreement with Poland in 1970, recognizing the border as final. And then he goes on to give a radio speech to the German refugees and their descendants. And he tells them this: it's over. We're not getting those lands back. It's not going to happen. This is in the past. We need to look to the future. We bring that speech in the book, and we basically say, cut and paste this speech to a Palestinian leader. That's the day we have peace. But it took a full generation for Germans to come to terms with that from the moment that no one indulged them. The Palestinians are still indulged. Even when that stops, it will still probably take a generation for a Palestinian leader to emerge and to tell his people it's over, hopefully her people, it's over, those lands are gone, from the river to the sea is not happening, we need to look to the future, and we need to have a vision of building a Palestinian state next to Israel rather than instead of it. And this is why I said, these days I consider myself a long-term peacemaker. I still very much believe that we can and should live next to each other, but to get to that, we in many ways need to let go of feeling good and start doing good.
Dr. Wilf, thank you for your talk and being with us today. And again, the book in question is The War of Return. We appreciate your being here and discussing this. And there are many questions that remain, as you can imagine. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. We'd be delighted to have you in Santa Fe at some point, if that's possible.
I'd like that. Thank you.